Aloha, welcome back. And to those of you joining us just now, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to session 5 of Pacific Forum's Advancing Women, Peace and Security in the Indo-Pacific Conference, entitled Gender and Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism, which is held in partnership with the US Indo-Pacific Command Office of Women, Peace and Security. My name is Tevi Bullock, and I'm a resident Women, Peace and Security Fellow at Pacific Forum. This session will examine the nexus between gender and preventing and countering violent extremism, or PVE-CVE. In this session, panelists will grapple with critical issues relating to how gender intersects with extremism, including, for example, the roles that women play in extremist organizations and how those roles differ from male counterparts. Further, this session will consider how a gender lens can be applied to understanding issues associated with the repatriation and rehabilitation of radicalized individuals. Please note that remarks made in today's program are on the record, and a audio recording of this session will be made available on the Pacific Forum website and Pacific Forum's and Indo-PACOM's YouTube channels in the future. Today's conference is a public webinar, which means there are individuals joining the event virtually who are not visible to the conference panelists and participants. Participants are welcome to keep their camera on or off during conference proceedings. We would like to remind our speakers to please keep their presentations to 10 minutes maximum so that we may have ample time for questions and discussions. You can find a detailed agenda of our past sessions in our virtual conference booklet, which can be accessed via the link being sent to the chat box. This conference booklet also provides detailed biographic information on all panelists and moderators. For the Q&A session, participants are encouraged to raise their hand or submit questions via the chat or Q&A box, and can do so at any time during the talks. So now it is my pleasure to begin session 5 by introducing our esteemed moderator, Ms. Pamela Delagi. Ms. Delagi is Professor of Practice, School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University. Previously, she was the Senior Advisor to the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General for Migration and was Director of the UN Population Fund Humanitarian Response Program for many years, working on women, peace and security issues, including sexual violence in conflict. She's also been heavily involved in the UN Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security. So Ms. Delagi, thank you so much for moderating this important session, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Tevi. My name is Pam Delagi, and I'm delighted to introduce this session's panel of speakers. We have quite a remarkable set of speakers here today on a topic which is both timely, painful, and fascinating. So I think you will all learn a lot, and I know I will learn a lot in this session. I'm only going to introduce briefly each panelist, but I recommend that you learn more about each of them from the virtual conference handbook, and I think Hannah has just posted that in the chat. Our first speaker this evening is Wing Commander Jade Devine, who's from the Directorate of Gender, Peace and Security in the Joint Capabilities Group in the Australian Department of Defense. Commander Devine, you're on.
Thank you, and I'll start by giving you a bit of a background. I know that I spoke about this partly in the previous session, but for those that either had to step away or weren't in the session. So I was deployed as the gender advisor to Operation Inherent Resolve last year. And the Operation Inherent Resolve is the international coalition to defeat Daesh in Iraq and Syria. And it's made up of 77 contributing nations. So I wanted to look at the role of not only women in countering and preventing violent extremism, but open it up a little bit more broadly to the role of gender in preventing and countering violent extremism. Because what we saw, particularly with Daesh, or as they're known in, I guess, the media and public forum, is ISIS. But Daesh understood and exploited gender roles as part of their strategy, arguably before Western militaries were tracking it. And they did it very, very effectively. So it was not only exploiting the role of women and how they used women as part of their strategy, but also the gender roles associated with men. And they used gender to gain control of the population by instilling fear and starting to destabilize communities, which then allowed them to step up their conflict and their strategy. And I'll just wait for that. There we go. But gender also featured part of their recruiting strategy, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail. But it also, they used the role of men as part of their recruiting strategy as well. In a vacuum of social support, they targeted male youth from rural areas where employment, literacy and income rates were really much lower through offering an income and a wife, which is two key social markers for Islamic society. So I think it would be remiss of us to narrow it only towards women in preventing and countering violent extremism, because I think the role of gender norms are larger at play as part of that as well. So next slide, please. So I'll look at three different aspects, particularly for women in preventing and countering violent extremism. The use of Daesh women fighters, the role of women within security forces within Iraq and Syria, and then the role of women within the population. Slide. So as I said, Daesh exploited gender as part of their strategy from the very start. They recognised the role of women in building the caliphate, and official Daesh doctrine actually enforced their role as the wife and mother of lion cubs, and really the teacher of generation and raising the next generation of fighters. They understood the hidden but influential roles women hold within families, and they were used in mobilisation efforts where women were encouraged and praised for their support of male family members that joined the caliphate. So again, they were really promoting and really appealing to those roles that women held within those family and community structures. And exploiting the Western military gender biases, which I think is probably, when we talk about what or how women can be involved in countering and preventing violent extremism, it's not only about women within the communities and women out there, but it's about our own gender biases and how we look, particularly from a military perspective, at the conflict setting. Knowing the gender biases that exist within the gendered roles, particularly from a Western perspective, they used women as couriers and smugglers for information, money and weapons. Through not only the gender roles and not having women on security checkpoints to be able to search other women, it was through their clothing. And just as a general social norm, women were able to pass through a lot more easily. I think from a military perspective, we often view this as kind of common sense or common knowledge that we need women to search other women, but it was certainly a feature of the operation that we were still talking about how Daesh were employing women at the most basic level. As we know, women are quite often more prominent in the online space, particularly where there are, I guess, more physical restrictions. And if you look at the conflict in Iraq, where they were kind of restricted to their homes and they weren't in employment roles. And so we saw that they were a lot more prominent in the online space and being able to mobilise forces. And we saw women brigades starting to pop up in the IDP camps, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. But it was really kind of understanding that Daesh were using women. I remember we were going through one campaign assessment where we were looking at the number of Daesh fighters that were left within the AO, and it was being reported as XXXX men. And so I asked the most obvious question, which to a gender advisor is fairly obvious. I asked them how many Daesh women were they tracking, and there was absolute silence. And so I think whilst at a theoretical or concept level, from a military perspective, we know that women can be combatants. I think sometimes we default back to our own gender biases when you're in the throes of the operation. And so it was really just making sure that that was front of mind, that we were tracking that as an issue. Slide. As I said, the IDP camps is an interesting one. And I would encourage you all to get online and do your own research, because there is a lot of good research coming out of the NGOs, particularly around our whole IDP camp. And IDP camps are an interesting one from a military perspective, because we more often than not don't have responsibility or ownership over the IDP camps. It's normally a host nation or a host government responsibility. And so it's a really delicate and sensitive one for us, because it's not something that we can directly influence a lot of the time. And the other part to that is IDPs and IDP camps, they're of themselves are not an issue. Both men and women, boys and girls can be IDPs. But our whole IDP camp is an interesting one, because it was made up of 90% women and children. And so it did become a gendered issue for us. And I'll get into the reasons why that was. So not only was it 90% women and children, there was a high proportion of Daesh women that existed within that IDP camp. So I just want to take you through how that came about, and I guess how gender does play into this PCVE type role. So the IDP camp was set up after the fall of Baghouz, which was the last Daesh stronghold in Syria. And what had happened, as they kind of rounded up the remnants, they were passing through the security screening, men and adolescent boys that were of fighting age were sent to detention centres because they were viewed as fighters, and that was the gender narrative in that space. Women and children were sent to IDP camps because they were seen as the victims within the conflict, irrespective of their status. Really comes back to what the gender perspective can bring and how gender norms and gender biases feed into the conflict, because despite Daesh having a high proportion of women within their operation, the gender norm within that culture was that women weren't combatants and they were only ever seen as victims. And so what it meant was that we ended up with these Daesh women brigades operating within our whole IDP camp, where they were running education camps for children on Daesh ideology. They were strictly enforcing allowable activities within the camps, and were punishing women that didn't subscribe to the Daesh ideology, either through assaults or burning down tents and that sort of thing. So it really became a risk to our mission in defeat of Daesh. And it gets back to the point I made in the previous session about operational relevance. So even though in Operation Inherent Resolve, we didn't have responsibility for the IDP camp, it did exist within our AO, and you have to reframe that as an operational risk, that this is a breeding ground for Daesh 2.0. You have a lot of vulnerable people, a lot of impressionable youth, and then being able to operate within the IDP camp, you can start to see how this would be a risk to regeneration in the future. The other part of that was that Daesh were financing these women that existed within the IDP camp. So they were posting online about the activities that they were doing and how committed they were to the Daesh ideology. And the more extreme their commitment was, the more money that they received. It also ended up that the more children they had, the more money they received. So we had a lot of the Daesh women that were actively taking custody of orphans that existed within the IDP camp. So you can already start to see some of the gendered issues that can fall out of what was a simple decision right at the very start, that men are fighters and women are victims, turns into quite a big security risk for the region and everything that we had kind of achieved there. The other aspect of IDPs from a PCVE issue is the reintegration of IDPs in the restabilisation and post-conflict situation. So what we started to see was that women were ostracised when they went back to their communities, either due to perceived affiliation with Daesh or whether it was real. So just because their second cousin's brother's uncle had been with Daesh, and whether that was voluntary or involuntary, they were then not allowed back into their communities. Children that were born to Daesh fighters did not have any status within either of the states. And so they had no access to education and healthcare. And the second and third order effects start to fall out of that, because if they don't have, a formal education, then they're more vulnerable to recruitment to VEOs in the future. And so you can really start to see how it will become a risk in the future. We also saw access to property being an issue because of property rights existing within Iraq, and male family members had taken over the property once that family had departed. So even though mothers were returning with their children and perhaps their husband had died in the conflict, they didn't have access to their property because it had either been taken over or one of the fighters had taken it over. And so that then leaves them vulnerable. And where do they go and how do they educate and raise their children? And so we really started to frame that, even though it wasn't something we could directly affect within our remit of what we had to deliver under Operation Inherent Resolve. And we really had to track and make sure that we stayed within our bounds because we were there to deliver a particular mission. But you can start to see some of the risks that would have to our mission to defeat Daesh when these vulnerabilities are starting to be created within the AO. Slide, please. The Iraq protests are another one because, again, from a gender perspective, it had impacts for both men and women. And we looked at this from a preventing violent extremism perspective. So what we saw early on were that young men were the face of the public protests, and particularly in the Western media. And I spoke to one Iraqi police officer, and we were talking about how this was really important from a gender perspective because it's not only a women's issue, it was affecting men. And he said, but what you didn't see in the Western media were the number of women that were contributing to those protests. And it was really interesting because it was the first time that we saw women's meaningful contribution where they were allowed to participate equally alongside their brothers in the protests in Tahrir Square in Baghdad. And it really signaled a shift to women's position within Iraq that they were allowed to have that voice. Unfortunately, what we did start to see, though, and I would argue because their voice was so successful and so effective, is that women activists started becoming targeted through death threats, kidnapping and murder, and particularly the more vocal human rights activists. But then this led us to track that as an early warning indicator that things were starting to destabilise within the campaign as well. As we know, one of the earliest indicators for violent extremism is the targeting of women and the silencing of women. And so, again, even though the Iraq protests were not something that Operation Inherent Resolve had a mandate for, I was able to track what was happening in the area of operations and feed that into our operational planning of what it meant for the situation in Iraq. And so that was just a brief overview, I guess, of some of the main roles that women had in preventing and countering violent extremism within the Iraq and Syria conflict. And I'll hand it over to the next panelist.
Thank you, Jade. This is fascinating. I think we could discuss this all night long. But for now, we will move on and come back to it later. Our next speaker is Ms. Jennifer Howe, who is the resident fellow in Women, Peace and Security at Pacific Forum, and who is starting her PhD studies in the War Studies Department at King's College. Jennifer?
Hi there. I'm just going to try and share some slides. So is everyone able to see them? Okay, good. Okay, so thanks very much for kind of letting me take the opportunity today to discuss some of my research. And in my presentation today, I'm going to talk about a short paper I'm currently writing on gender and domestic extremism in the US and Indonesia. So I'll focus on far-right extremist groups in the US and Islamist extremist groups in Indonesia. And I think it's really important to look at the similarities between groups with different ideological leanings and how they interpret and use gender, because it can help us identify common features in how extremist groups function. So I want to start off by just emphasizing that women play very diverse roles in contemporary extremist groups, and they contribute to these groups in both violent and non-violent ways. So in Indonesia, for example, experienced 2 IS-linked attacks involving women in March this year. The first involved a newlywed couple, and the second involved a 25-year-old woman who opened fire at the National Police headquarters in Jakarta. And these incidents aren't or shouldn't be seen in isolation, because they actually form part of a broader trend in which women extremists across Southeast Asia in general and also globally have adopted increasingly frontline roles. And women are also visible and violent supporters of far-right extremist organizations in the US, like QAnon, which is for those of you who don't know, it's a pro-Trump movement grounded in baseless conspiracy theories surrounding the existence of a secret child sex trafficking ring comprised of liberal elites. And it's also just kind of a loose collection of different conspiracy theories. And women members of QAnon in the US have actually been highly active and committed violent attacks. So just last year, for instance, one woman in Texas drove her car into a group of people who she believed to be trafficking children. And we also know that women played violent roles in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And then alongside these more violent roles, women in both Indonesia and the US have also provided non-violent support to extremist groups. So for example, women in Indonesia have created online platforms to disseminate IS ideology. And in the US, women are often recruited by other women to QAnon through lifestyle blogs or online parent groups, also known as mum groups. So despite women's active contributions to contemporary extremist organizations, they continue to be viewed in very narrow terms, particularly as kind of the victims of male-instigated violence or mothers able to prevent their sons from becoming terrorists. And it's also routinely assumed that women are manipulated or duped into joining extremist groups. And these assumptions are very much grounded in gender stereotypes, particularly the notions that women are inherently peaceful and that they lack agency, and also that they're motivated by personal and emotional factors as opposed to political factors. So, for instance, the belief that mothers can be mobilized to counter extremism disregards the fact that in some contexts, mothers can actually be vectors for extremism within their families, while the assumption that women are manipulated into joining extremist groups conceals their voluntary enrollment in these groups and crucially their motives for engaging in these groups, which results in gender-blind PCVE programs. So the need to develop gender-sensitive counter-narratives to extremist propaganda is urgent because extremist messaging is highly gendered and often taps into the unique needs of women and men. For example, extremist groups often exploit women's fears to garner their support. So some of you might remember during New Year's Eve in 2015, there were reports of widespread sexual violence perpetrated by men of mostly non-European origin against women in a number of German cities. And far-right groups capitalized on these attacks. They used them to kind of fan the flames of xenophobia, but also to accuse the German authorities of being inactive and also complicit in the abuse. And through this narrative, these groups framed themselves as the sole protectors of women's rights. And a similar tactic has been employed by extremist groups in Mindanao, which is a majority Muslim region in the southern Philippines and also the site of a long-running insurgency. And women in Mindanao, like many women in conflict settings, are exposed to disproportionately high rates of gender-based violence. Extremist messaging targeting women in Mindanao asserts that the violence they endure is a direct consequence of living under a non-Islamic government, and that the Philippine government is ordering its security personnel to carry out attacks against women, which again frames these groups as the sole protectors of women's rights, and is a very similar method of recruiting women to what we see in Germany. So it doesn't change regardless of the context or the ideological leaning of these groups. And then traditional gender roles are also often promoted in extremist messaging. So in online extremist content in Indonesia, the word woman frequently appears alongside the words mother, wife, and child. Likewise, far-right groups promote women's roles as wives and mothers, which is closely connected to white supremacy and right-wing anti-feminist rhetoric. So in the US, for instance, we've seen a rise recently in traditional wives, or trad wives as they're abbreviated to, a group of white nationalist mum bloggers who promote the virtues of staying at home, submitting to male leadership, and bearing lots of children. So I hope that by demonstrating some of the ways that gender intersects with extremism, I've illustrated the importance of applying a gender lens to PCVE. And I now just want to turn to how Indonesia and the US have integrated gender into domestic PCVE and counterterrorism policies. So in my opinion, Indonesia has made more progress than the US in this area. So for example, Indonesia's National Counterterrorism Agency has made an effort to try and engage or recruit more women into its ranks as practitioners, for example, as religious preachers and psychologists. While Indonesia's new National Action Plan on Countering Violent Extremism received significant civil society input, so numerous civil society actors were consulted in the drafting process, including women's groups and women activists. However, more substantive changes are needed for Indonesia to fully integrate gender into national PCVE policies. For example, women are still very much underrepresented in decision-making roles in the National Counterterrorism Agency, as well as security sector roles. And importantly, there needs to be an increase in gender-specific narratives, counter-narratives to extremist propaganda. Now, turning to the US, the US has been very slow to apply a gender lens in domestic PCVE programming. So in June, the Biden administration released the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. And although the strategy has been viewed as a positive development because it's kind of the first time the government has fully recognized the threat of right-wing extremism within US borders, there's major issues in how it tackles gender, especially in that it basically just lacks nuance. So there's a 30-page document that sets out the plan, and in that document, women is mentioned twice and gender once, and all three times were in reference to women as a vulnerable group likely to be attacked by extremist organizations. So that's completely overlooking women's active support for far-right groups in the US. And then just to finish off, I just wanted to outline some very general policy recommendations for both Indonesia and the US. So firstly, both countries must design gender-sensitive PCVE programs that recognize the multifaceted roles that women play in extremist groups. And women should also be given a voice in designing PCVE programs to enable them to communicate how they understand key drivers of extremism within their communities, what actions they think should be taken to address these drivers, and what roles they want to take, if any, in responding to extremism. And secondly, the US and Indonesia should really share best practices for addressing online radicalization and developing gender-sensitive counter-narratives. And this would also help to create a more unified response to online propaganda. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jennifer. This is getting ever more interesting, and harking back to Valerie Hudson's talk this morning about how we are thinking in the US about violent extremism as well, and related to the Afghan situation. Thank you. Next, I'd like to welcome Ms. Amalina Abdul Nasser, who is a global intelligence analyst based in Singapore.
Hi, thank you, Pam. Thank you so much. Very happy to be with everyone here. I'm sure most of you have been having, a lot of fun-packed activity with a lot of panel sessions from the previous sessions within the conference. Thank you so much to Pacific Forum for having me here and to be with this esteemed panel here. I really hope to bring some perhaps perspective or adding dimensions to our discussion by roping in perspective from Southeast Asia. For myself, I do not have any slides accompanying my presentation, but hopefully, we can keep up with my sharing. And I think hearing from Commander Jade as well as Jennifer, I think what I'm about to share very much builds on their initial presentations. And interestingly, with Jennifer, it's something that I have looked at in that particular area as well. So I think we can draw a lot of comparison from there. So for Southeast Asia, at least, I'll argue that it's slightly a unique situation where the shift and progress in terms of trends isn't as fast or up to speed as the rest of the region. And by Southeast Asia, I actually am referring to countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and to some extent, Singapore. Within Southeast Asia region itself, we have seen two pertinent points of shift within women's role in terrorist organizations. For the first one is when we saw the shift when the prominence of Jama'ah Islamiyah started crumbling within this region, and when Islamic State or Daesh started seeping into the picture. This is something that I've discussed at great length in one of my papers, where essentially the role of women are largely envisioned as domestic roles and those restricted within the private sphere. And this is something that Jennifer has kindly expanded at great length, largely as daughters, wives, and mothers within terrorist organizations. But when Daesh came into the picture, and I cite social media and widespread use of technology as a catalyst by providing platform for female militants to take up more active roles. And here what I mean is that they are being recruiters online. And because of this platform, they are able to speak with the opposite gender, start recruiting them into the network. And also because of social media and this platform, the shift, it really brings about shift in the dynamic from a rather patriarchal organization to a more egalitarian one online. And with technology as well, having blogs and chat rooms really allowed women to also communicate with the opposite gender, with also women from beyond geographical boundary, and essentially linking them to terrorists and extremists from IS Central. And hence, I would say that it really motivates them further to make the hijrah and to further the cause of jihad for the survival of the caliphate. So all in all, I think at this point, we can summarize the role of women into 6 broad categories, and that is as wives, as daughters, online recruiters, to some extent as supporters as well, both financially as well as logistically, as well as definitely sympathizers as well as propagandists. To that end, I shan't discount the fact that there are certain groups of female militants who, because of their position, grants them certain level of resources, network, as well as authority for them to play a much active role. And I cite examples such as the matriarch of the Maute clan, Farhana Maute, who was an astute business owner. She had several properties, and that came with a lot of financial backing and logistical support that she was able to render the group. And also for Rafika Hanum, the wife of Bahru Naim, who orchestrated a lot of attacks between 2015 and 2016. And that brings us to the second shift, which happened much recently when the role of women within this region expanded into the 7th category. And that's something that we call as militants, attackers, or some of us would call it as armed combatants. And that started with the first family-based attack in Surabaya in Indonesia in 2018. And then from there, we actually saw a steady rise of female militancy in this region. That very same year, we saw an attempt of vehicle ramming by a housewife in Malaysia. Subsequently, in 2019, we saw the holo bombings in the Philippines. We saw knife-wielding attacks to the Indonesia's security minister. And then early this year with the holo twin bombings in the Philippines, all in all are carried out by female militants. And this shift is sort of something that we see in tandem with a new wave of narrative happening online. But it's becoming more apparent that radical women within this region are increasingly becoming sort of unreceptive to their assigned traditional roles. In social media platforms, including perhaps chatters within Telegram groups, they organize themselves into groups to express really bolder view. venting frustration and their desire to raise arms and play more active role and spill blood for the survival of the caliphate. And all in all, it can be encapsulated that they feel rather sidelined, a lot of frustration that they want to be as useful and as involved as their male counterparts. However, even so, it's very much challenging to monitor such chatters, as these Telegram groups tend not to stay that long to be monitored. So it's rather uncertain, with the pandemic, with COVID, if such women-specific narratives still persist today, and to what extent does it bring influence? Because as much of the shifts happening online, it's not something that we see trickling offline. The impact and the shift is not picking up as fast in the physical world as it is in the online space. So that is where we are in the region today. There is no doubt that terrorist organization like Daesh within the region has opened up for women to take up more masculine roles, seeing from the various propaganda materials where the portrayal of women, either through pictures or citing historical or fundamental narratives, are still heavily gendered, but has also changed from the traditional depiction of a mother or a daughter to female fighters in military fatigues as well as combat arms. And so as the role of women continues to, I don't think it will continue to expand, but as it expands, the correct understanding and definitely the implementation of gender mainstreaming is becoming increasingly important, especially in this region. At the moment, organizations, government agencies, and private sectors, both top-down and bottom-up initiatives, are still missing the mark, in the sense that involvement of women within CT outfits are largely for representation and not very much influence in terms of policy outreach and planning. And I think this builds on from what Jennifer has shared. For example, while gender mainstreaming in Indonesia has been weaved into its national policy since 2002, women as part of the National Counterterrorism Agency, BNPT, has largely been rendered administrative roles. So it's more of representation instead of participation. And meanwhile, if I were to compare the efforts done by bottom-up initiatives, civil society organizations, there has been a lot of tremendous effort of involving women at the forefront, especially in terms of being the face of counter violent extremism initiatives. However, there's still lack of gender slant in terms of the counter messaging. Presently, counter narratives are being presented more on the generic front, on the generic level. And so the importance that needs to be driven home is the fact that it's not only the messenger that is needed, but also the gender slant in the messaging. However, all in all, it's not that bleak. We have made notable progress within this region. I would say that last year, Malaysia has appointed its first counterterrorism chief, Norma Isha, on February 2020, and I hope those kind of appointments will be further complemented with more female specialists at the forefront of PCV content, programs, rehabilitation, reintegration, community engagement, and education efforts. So I guess all in all, in summary, I've shared the shifting role of women within terrorist organization since Jama'ah Islamiyah to where it is today, the kind of narrative that we're seeing online, as well as the mismatch in terms of gender mainstreaming and in terms of policy, what needs to be done. Definitely, there's more room to be explored and to be implemented, but we are likely seeing structural issues such as culture or perhaps the cost to even overhaul the entire system, and practices might come at a really huge cost. And with that, I think I'll conclude for now. I welcome thoughts, reactions, and more than happy to pick this up later at the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you, Emelina. I am very impressed with the discipline of people on this panel. Everybody's keeping to below the 10 minutes. Remarkable. Our last speaker is Ms. Pamela Faber of the Center for Naval Analysis. I think, I'm just guessing, we might be moving from some places in Asia to some places in Africa as well. Ms. Faber, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you so much to Pacific Forum and the Indo-Pacific WPS team for having me. I was able to join a little bit early and heard a little bit from the previous panel, and also in hearing my fellow panelists today. It's just such an honor to be in the presence of so many accomplished and motivated people. And so thank you all. So I'm going to spend my opening remarks talking as well about what roles women play in extremist organizations. But in order to minimize repetition, I'm going to try to introduce a slightly different framework, and also talk through some macro trends. And so for a bit of background, although I'm here in a personal capacity, I spend my days as a research scientist and a project director at CNA. And in this role, I've been asked to look at issues surrounding violent extremism from various perspectives, including the roles of women and gender in BEOs and whether gender considerations are integrated into CT and CVE efforts. And so my team at CNA, we recently produced a study called Understanding Gender and Violent Extremism that looked at some of these issues, and it's publicly available if anyone's interested. So I'm going to draw on that for some reflections. So these reflections, they come from looking at the roles of women and the role of gender, so two separate topics, right, related but separate, in 9 different VEOs around the world. And these included, there were different VEOs from kind of across different time periods as well. So this included the FARC, ISIS, Boko Haram, the LRA, Lord's Resistance Army, Al-Shabaab, and others. And we look specifically at recruitment of women, at women's roles, and at treatment of women as well, and gender roles. And so, going into this work, we knew that female engagement in political violence, and also the study of that, it's not a new phenomenon. There is a lot of work in this area. There's a lot of stereotypes, but there's a lot of work in this area. And while experts generally agree that terrorist groups and VEOs have, according to some metrics, been overwhelmingly dominated by men, there's also this growing body of research on how women play integral roles in political violence throughout history. But most portrayals of women in these groups, as been expressed by other panelists, they continue to reflect gender stereotypes. And so in short, what this study tried to do was to really dive into what the unexpected and understudied roles that women play are across these different groups. And, the first thing that we found was that the dominant stereotypes about women's roles in BEOs, they miss the vast majority of female activity in these groups. And I think that's crucial because it's not just that they're kind of inaccurate, it's that they're really wholly inaccurate to some degree for some groups. And additionally, they fundamentally fail to capture women's lived experiences. And so we're all familiar with these stereotypes, and in my mind, they kind of fall across 3 different paradigms. Women as the mothering figure, which has been touched on. Women as kind of these unnatural, unfeminine monsters. And also women who are viewed just in the lens of their sexuality or sexualized individuals, usually in the form of sex workers or sex slaves. And what we found was that women played many more roles than the stereotypes suggested. And so the framework that I'm going to suggest is that specifically women played supporting roles, enabling roles, and operational roles. And this can have kind of policy implications if we think about it according to that lens. And so briefly to kind of define them, supporting roles were those roles that assisted in maintaining the environment of the violent extremist organization. And so these are some roles that may be seen as part of a typical stereotype. So women serving as psychological support, child rearing, household management. If the BEO is in an encampment somewhere, kind of supporting the maintenance of that encampment. Enabling roles were those that directly assisted the development of the BEO's networks and operations. And this is the category that's often largely overlooked, and it made up the majority. And so these are things like smuggling or transporting weapons, recruiting, fundraising, building out social networks in a way that helps the organization. And finally, operational roles, which are those that involve direct engagement in kinetic activity. A second finding across these groups was that we found that women served in more types of roles than men, which is really quite interesting if you think about it. And this is because women, unlike men, served in roles that were both seen as traditionally male and traditionally female. And so in addition to a large number of roles that were usually exclusively seen as within the remit of women, like child rearing, our data demonstrated that women also served in almost all of the roles that were typically associated with men. And, you know, an interesting contrast is if you think of even some of the most kind of egalitarian videos, if we can use some of that language, like the FARC, like the PKK, men were not engaged in all supporting roles, such as child rearing or household management, despite this kind of narrative of equality. And so third, when we compared the groups to each other, some really interesting things emerged. We found that women in religious groups were more likely to serve in supportive roles, whereas women in secular groups were more likely to serve in operational roles. And again, this is all in a macro sense, there are exceptions. We found that religious groups rarely, if ever, explicitly incorporated women into leadership ranks. And this was kind of a stark contrast to leftist groups, which frequently incorporated women into leadership ranks and actually used that in propaganda. But crucially, we found that all of the VEOs, just regardless of ideological orientation, accepted women in these enabling role categories. And so, for instance, nearly all groups utilized women specifically for smuggling, as was earlier discussed, as well as recruitment, propagandizing, fundraising, intelligence collection, and transporting weapons. Fourth, we were able to make some interesting observations about the evolution of women's roles, both within and between groups over time. We found that the evolution of women's roles across groups, so across different groups, reflected macro shifts in ideology. And so, for example, in our data, groups that formed earlier usually held more Marxist ideologies, and groups that formed later generally held more conservative ideologies. And these norms that the groups held were reflected in the gender roles that women played. And within specific groups, when you try to look at the evolution of women's roles within specific groups, what we actually found was that it was largely driven by exogenous factors. And so factors outside really of the group's control, that created a need, a significant need for women in a greater variety of roles. And so what that means is that technically the gender roles in the groups could have stayed the same about what role women, quote unquote, should have played. But women's roles changed, and this was a reflection of necessity to have somebody, male or female, serve in a particular capacity. And finally, in a macro sense, we found that the treatment of women over time has changed. Both violence against women and the degree of control over women's bodies in groups has increased. And within our case studies, this was correlated, and we're not saying this was the cause of it, but it was correlated over time to a decline in leftist and self-declared feminist VEOs and a rise in conservative VEOs over time. And so before I close, I just want to reflect on one of our main conclusions, which I think ties to the question of why this matters. Throughout the process of doing that research and kind of processing these issues, we also looked at US Department of Defense counterterrorism and counter-violent extremism activities. And we found that these efforts do not consider the roles that men and women play from a nuanced perspective, and that there was disproportionate influence by gender stereotypes that shape the expectations of men and women's roles. And a lot of this could be traced to, in my view, a misunderstanding still of gender as a concept, and a misunderstanding about gender roles and essentially the difference between gender and women when we're looking at some of these issues. And we often hear that there can be a limit sometimes, a self-limiting element to gender-considered approaches to counterterrorism, in that they often focus solely on women. And this is an issue because it contributes not only to a lack of knowledge around women's roles, but also other operationally relevant areas, which has been discussed, such as the relationship between extremism and masculinity, and the effects of gender norms as a driver for radicalization, and much more. And so I think I will close there, and more than happy to join the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pamela. Thanks to all of the panelists, and we now have a little more than 20 minutes to have discussion here. I'm seeing some questions already, but let me remind you that if you have questions or comments, please type your question in the Q&A window or in the chat window. But if you want to ask a question verbally, audience members can raise your hand. You see at the bottom of your Zoom screen the little hand, and you can raise it and we will call on you. And please state your name and affiliation and who the question is for. I see Rob's hand is already up, but let me go to the first question already in the chat from Karen Knudsen. And I think this is for Jennifer. And Karen is saying that you listed several policy recommendations at the end of your presentation. What steps do you plan to take, or have you already taken to advance those recommendations?
Hi, yeah, thank you for that question. So I think, well, in this specific instance, I'm working towards writing a short paper. So one of Pacific Forum's PACnets that will contain kind of concrete policy recommendations. So hopefully that will encourage, policymakers, if they read it, to kind of look into bringing gender into PCVE. I'm particularly interested as well in trying to encourage or looking into how the US can improve the gendered lens in PCVE and domestic extremism, just because I think it's really lacking in kind of the Biden strategy. But yeah, so basically just writing a short paper, and I suppose hoping that policymakers will read it. So
thank you. I noticed there was an FBI report today that the Proud Boys have been issuing lots of social media messages that have an odd but predictable juxtaposition, I guess, of misogyny and xenophobia, praising the Taliban in Afghanistan for seizing back their country and defending their religion and traditions, but at the same time saying we don't want Afghan refugees in the US because they are Muslim and might be terrorists. So certainly there's a huge need in the US for more thoughtfulness about this. Let me call on Rob York.
Yes, that was an ideal segue, because I was actually going to ask about the Proud Boys. They are one of the more notorious far-right groups in America. And I was going to ask Jen if a group of extremist group with that kind of male-centric branding, they also are quite notorious for policing their membership and excluding women quite purposefully as well. And I'm wondering if that is something you have seen in other countries. And also, does that contribute toward the idea that this is a problem among men specifically?
I'm not sure. I mean, I can't think of parallels in other countries, but I think that, I'm sure there are, but I think that the this thing of I mean, I think it is kind of those types of groups obviously are, you know, male centric, and so that does make it in a way a male centric issue. But there's also been a rise in these groups kind of looking to recruit women, or far right groups in the US certainly looking to recruit women, and also women who are kind of actively, you know, wanting to be a part of these groups, like the traditional wives type of thing, which is part of kind of the broader issue of white supremacy and those types of groups. And I think like a lot of the extremism is it's motivated by kind of political and economic grievances and that type of thing. And I think that isn't particular to men. And I think that these groups, these kind of anti-women rhetoric can also apply and can also draw in women. But yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're dealing with an overtly misogynistic group, then it is more male centric, I guess. But I don't think women are immune from that, if that makes sense.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat from Jackie True. This is for Pamela, saying, given your finding that the increasing VEO targeting of violence against women, that is control over women's bodies, is associated with the decline of leftist VEOs with ostensibly feminist political ideologies, can you offer any global explanations for the shift given the greater political empowerment of women globally?
Wow, that is such a fantastic question and really challenging one. So I'm going to try to tackle it in a few parts. You know, I think, so when you're looking across groups, it is very difficult to make those macro, to kind of attribute any sort of causality to that, right? Because it is incredibly complex to say that everything is, has the potential to have an exception. But that said, I think the first way that I would try to answer that question is look at the complexity of women's opportunities and roles within certain groups where there's more kind of control and possibly, you know, suppression of women's roles. And so, for instance, and by that I mean we need to ask what women we're talking about within each of these groups. And so, for example, you know, within a group like Al-Shabaab, for instance, that you know, it is not a feminist group, is not, you know, advancing women's rights, is not empowering women, right? Even within that group, looking at the difference between sort of the treatment of Kenyan and Somali women, for instance, within the group, looking about how women see themselves as possible members of the group or not as members of the group, which differs. And also looking at kind of to try to put women's agency kind of back even into the groups where women are oppressed as well. Thinking about the reason why women join certain groups, right? So when some women were drawn to kind of the leftist and feminist groups, it was due to a desire for the emancipation that these groups promised. But when women cite joining groups that are avowedly anti-feminist, sometimes that is actually a reason why women join. And so all of that is to say that, you know, that's a tough question. I don't know if I have a great macro answer for it. But if you look at the group level, there are these kind of interesting examples where women are kind of engage, where women essentially have agency, but they're choosing it to kind of join for reasons that may not actually promote that agency within a specific group. And so, you know, women and VEOs are not homogenous, and it's really difficult to make universal claims about them. And so I think that there can be this interpretation where you can have this kind of growing awareness of women's agency and growing women's agency and kind of the global conversation. And at the same time, women joining or being involved in groups that are kind of suppressing this agency. And so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I think that might be a question that Emelina or Jade may want to respond to as well.
The only insights I will add to that from, I guess, a tactical and operational perspective is we saw that both at the beginning of the Daesh campaign and then as they were starting to lose, I guess, their caliphate. And it was almost a stand of last resort because I think the empowerment of women, particularly in that political social sphere, was so successful. And so we kind of saw that even though the tragic circumstances in which it brought about, it was almost at a macro level a measure of success because it was kind of their last fight to try and oppress women because women were being so successful.
I think if I can also just chime in a bit, I think this reminded me for a period, I think about 2017, 2018, when we started seeing Telegram groups of purely women really expressing and really that desire to be playing more active roles as equivalent as men. I think I touched this briefly in my remarks, where we are seeing women with bolder views asking for some level of emancipation from the traditional roles and really wanting to take up arms and fight at the front lines alongside their male counterparts. And I think that sort of trend is somewhat very similar to the question that was posed. And I think that really drives the point of just wanting that level of liberation and that level of same level of contribution and recognition towards the organization. And I think, but that sort of observation was rather brief. So that's something that I can't really drive home the point if it's something that's still rather consistent until today. But I think that that's a very interesting trend to compare with what we are seeing globally as well.
Melina, while we've got you here, let me ask you something else. You have been looking a lot at social media issues, and recent research on politics and social media have identified gender bullying and shaming techniques as part of strategies. Do extremist networks use similar techniques?
So for this particular question, I think by and large, we don't see it much, at least within the Southeast Asia region. But we did see it briefly when the rise of female militancy or the chatters towards that skew of taking more masculine roles started to gain some level of traction. So it's more of chatters vis-a-vis narratives or even propaganda outright out there. It happens within rather close groups within Facebook, Telegram, and other social media platforms. So I wouldn't say that it is framed as gender bullying, but it's more of shaming of men for not taking up arms and that sort of also sort of an opportunistic avenue that women will then fulfill that role because the male counterparts are not doing so. But even so, it was a really short runway of really seeing the efficacy of seeing that sort of branch out and looking at the effects in the physical world. So I think it definitely happens now and then within more sleeper cells within encrypted platforms. But it's definitely something that we don't see outright of distinctively in the offline in terms of waging attacks and such.
Thank you. Jade, on a little bit different track here, given your experience in Iraq as a gender advisor, how do you think gender advisors should be trained? You've done a remarkable analysis of what was going on there in Daesh, but how do we teach people to do this kind of analysis? So there aren't just a few experts, but lots and lots of people who can see these things.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's having been involved in the ADF Gender Advisor course for quite a while. I find it such a interesting course to teach because unlike a lot of other military courses that are very content driven, and ours does have a lot of content, I think it's almost an operational art to be a gender advisor. It's teaching a way of thinking. Yes, you can teach content and trends, and increasing violence against women is an indicator of a destabilizing community, and there are certain markers that you can teach and knowledge that you need to have, but you need to teach them a way of looking at a situation. I think even walking into a room now, and I think it's been mentioned either in this session or the previous one, is that the gender considerations may not even be immediately obviously to you as a trained and experienced gender advisor, but it will come out as you continue to, I guess, scan the environment and monitor what's happening. So I think it's more about teaching a way of thinking as opposed to teaching pure content, because applying that perspective is looking at a situation from a different viewpoint, and sometimes people do that really well, and others it is a little more challenging. I think particularly being a military gender advisor is being fluent in operational processes. You can have all the gender knowledge and advice in the world, but if you don't know how and when to integrate it into what is a very complex military machine, then your voice and your input will be lost. So it's knowing when to press an issue and when to hold. It's knowing at what particular point of the decision-making process you need your input. I think so often gender advisors are assigned as one of the specialist advisors to a commander, whereas from my experience, being involved in the operational working groups at the practitioner level is much more effective, and your voice gets heard early on, because by the time a decision gets to a commander or to execution, the work's already been done. So you really need to kind of get in early. So understanding those operational processes, understanding their language, and being able to talk the talk with them, because as anyone who's worked with the military known is we have our own language and our own way of doing things. So being able to operate within that space is critically important to being successful as a gender advisor.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking for questions in the Q&A here. I'm not seeing things, but there are some people, I can see the writing in the chat there. Let me ask, Jade, let me just follow up on that. If you knew then, or if people in the command structure knew then what you know now about what happened in Iraq, were there different kinds of interventions that could have been undertaken or that you would have recommended?
Yeah, I think definitely there's a lot of really good lessons that we've learned from that conflict. As I said, one of the earliest ones when they, segregated men to detention centers and women to IDP camps, like that was a decision that was made very early on. I think one of the challenges as being a military gender advisor is that we need to stay within our own scope. The military is there at the invitation of the host government. And so we really need to make sure that we stay in our lane. So I think, as has been said in the previous sessions, gender, peace and security is not a military issue. It is a whole of government global issue. So across the board, if we can get earlier intervention, acknowledge our own gender biases and apply that early, then that would have made, I guess, the world of difference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm just reading. Still people are writing in the chat, but it's not showing up here yet. Somebody finish your question, please.
Since we do have some time, I think the other important role that women play, particularly in preventing and countering violent extremism, is their participation in those organic security forces. If we look at the women of the YPJ in Syria, so the women's arm of the YPG, they were instrumental in delivering a lot of the countering violent extremism outcomes that we were seeking. So I think that's a really good example of how women can contribute in a more formal capacity. Quite often we talk about women's roles in community structures and that sort of thing, and particularly the Kurdish women that fought ISIS early on and were really successful, and looking at why they join those security forces and why they want to be involved is because they've seen, I guess, the masculine approach to resolving conflict and have seen why that hasn't worked. And so they come at it from a much more philosophical perspective of wanting to resolve conflict in their own way.
I'm reminded of all the years that there were so many disarmament and demobilization programs going on where nobody was thinking at all about gender aspects. And, you know, taking arms from men and giving money to men and not even involving women in any stage of that process in places like Liberia or Sierra Leone or other post-conflict situations. It's quite remarkable. I mean, a lot has been done, though. I would say in the past 15 years, there's been almost a revolution in understanding of some of these things, thanks to people like all of the panelists and all of the people at this conference right now. I am reminded here that we are supposed to be closing. We have 10 minutes left for Q&A. Okay, very good. I was going by the earlier schedule. But, you know, it's great to have military and security people and others in a conference because everyone keeps to the time. In academic conferences, we would still be going 4 or 5 hours from now. So I admire all of your discipline.
Sorry, Pam, I can just see a question there from Jennifer Atkinson, if you wanted me to address that.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yep. So Jennifer's question is, noting that the roots of WPS is being in civil society women's groups, have you had pushback about the military contribution to this space? I was actually really fortunate in Inherent Resolve in that we had quite a few gender advisors involved in the area. There were 2 UN missions in Iraq. They each had gender practitioners within them. We had the Women's Affairs Division within the government of Iraq who were obviously dedicated to progressing gender equality within Iraq. And so we actually formed a WPS forum where we could collaborate and work together. Again, getting back to that point that this is not a military issue, it's not a civil society issue. It is an everyone issue, and we need to work together to be able to solve it. So that was really effective because, getting back to my previous point where we could identify risks that were happening within the IDP camps, I couldn't solve that. It wasn't part of the OIR mandate, but I had the classified information that I could see it. And so then I could leverage those other gender practitioner networks who could play in that space, because as a military organisation, had we have stuck our finger in that pie, that would have been really bad for us. But I could leverage those networks, and similarly, they could, you know, the military is a big machine with a lot of resources. So if they could identify opportunities that they couldn't resource, then they could lean on me to help them deliver outcomes. So it was actually a really effective civil society, government and military network within Iraq.
Thank you, Jade. A question now in the Q&A from Michelle Ibanez, saying there were multiple discussion points around affordances of technology, specifically online versus offline behavior of women. Can you speak to this a little more? Has there been research exploring VEO's behavior activity online from a gender-specific perspective? Maybe I'll ask Amelina first.
Yes. So in terms of, okay, so I think at least from the Southeast Asia point of view, which I think is still, you know, very similar and resonate across other regions. For the kind of behaviors that we're seeing different online versus offline is largely because women within the VEOs are not allowed to, say, communicate or interact with the opposite gender in the offline space. That's A, and hence they play more active participation in roles within the online space. So that's why we're seeing them as propagandists as well as recruiters, and also as financiers as well. And that is something that we're seeing at least more and more so in Singapore, where we have had women governing and actually building networks of their own, and especially for terrorist funding as well. And secondly, in terms of combatants, and I think this is something that we're seeing very much new, although the overall roles that they carry are still largely gendered. And that's something that within the offline space, it's something that women are able to advance. And those are at least the 2 point of differences. In terms of research exploring VEO's behavior activity online from a gender specific perspective, I believe I have came across maybe 2 or 3 literatures at least, and one from the UN Women Research. I can try to look it up and drop the link, or share it directly to Michelle. But yeah, I think I welcome Jennifer, Pam, or Commander Jade to also share their thoughts on this.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I can jump in briefly here, Emily, and I think that was such a fantastic answer, and I completely agree with some of the ways that you described it. And I would highlight again, how in the digital space, how womanhood, right, and women are propagandized differently and in different ways. And this is something that we've seen across groups, right? If you look again at the macro sense, groups use narratives online, both women and men as the main actor in this case, in order to portray women in a certain way, using certain gender norms to highlight the kind of ideological perspective or goals of the group in order to, demonstrate a perspective, but also clearly for recruitment purposes. And so, we've seen ISIS use women in different ways. It's been described as portraying women as victims of violence, also as, taking on different roles in the group. We've seen sort of attractive women and girls being used as a marketing strategy for certain groups. The FARC was very active in this space. I shouldn't say all there, perhaps ironically, we've seen women in messaging to signal groups' inclusivity. And there's an interesting example here that in the European, some far right groups, there was a Miss Hitler beauty contest that highlighted women in the group. And it was an effort to show other women that women played a role in this group and that they were kind of prioritized and highlighted. And it kind of reminded me of some of the trad wife narrative. And so, and I think that also in the online space, women acting as individuals who kind of build networks online is another thing that we've seen. And so I'd say that those are kind of two ways I'd think about the online space. It's kind of network building and propagandized womanhood in different ways.
Okay, just a few more minutes. Let me ask one question that has come up is that this is for men and women, for everyone, but particularly interesting maybe for women, and that is, what are the triggers that cause people to shift roles between being a nonviolent sympathizer of a group to an active participant and on to engaging in violence? And if we can identify some of those triggers, what are the possible interventions that could be used to help prevent people making that transition? And if I can get everybody to answer that one, it would be great.
I could jump in first. And so I think that, when we're looking at kind of radicalization and using words like triggers, there is a lot of literature that talks about this cognitive opening that exists when folks are kind of on a spectrum of radicalization. And, perhaps if something happens and they have this cognitive opening, right, that is often kind of filled with a solution narrative that can be violent. And so this can be an instance where somebody goes from being, a sympathizer to someone who's more active. And some of the data that I've seen and come across, if we kind of marry that up to some of the frequently cited reasons that women join PEOs, those are, nationalist sentiment is high up there, a desire for respect and a new identity, social advancement, the promise of protection, right? That implies that there was perhaps harm, a desire for revenge, which also implies that there was some trauma, escape from traditional, whatever that means in that society, gender roles, and other things as well. And so I think that, trying to think about what those push and pull factors are is an opportunity for engagement. And the other issue I just link back here is the question of membership and what membership to these groups actually means in the context of being a woman in these societies, because it's quite varied. Women might consider themselves members while men don't. Men might consider only certain women members, maybe foreign fighters, women who come from other places. And so, yes, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer, any thoughts on that?
I think Pamela covered it really well, but I guess just another thing to add is that there's a kind of common assumption that women and men's pathways to radicalization very much differ, and the trigger that kind of prompts individuals to seek out extremist ideology. But interviews held with women who joined extremist ISIS from Indonesia showed this kind of actually that women follow a very similar kind of pathway to men, or are prompted by very similar drivers. So usually it's a personal crisis that then cause these women to seek out a gateway religious group, and then from that they became more aware of kind of the political injustices against the global Muslim community, and then that would kind of push them to seek out even more kind of radical ideologies, and from those radical ideologies also being drawn into the idea of starting afresh in kind of the so-called caliphate and stuff like that. So basically I think it's a process that it's often assumed that women are just motivated by marriage or by very kind of personal factors or emotional factors, but it's actually a real mix, I think, for most people, because the process of radicalization is so complex and psychological. So yeah.
Thank you. Amelina?
Yes, just as I mute myself, I actually wanted to offer two more points with regards to what Jennifer and Pam has just shared. I think two things that came to mind. Firstly, would be in terms of the narrative of what they are seeing online, especially in extremist groups or extremist Facebook groups and such. They are putting up more propagandas in terms of playing on narrative of women taking up arms and really leading resistance back during the history. There's a lot more in terms of pictorially depicting women taking up arms. They are tapping into historical activities showing that, women don't just show the roles as women, as mothers, but also women then has taken arms. So, why not you now? And secondly, I would say that actually came to mind would be the fundamental ideology that these women are exposed to. And I think I'll quote the example of Puri Kuswati, the first female suicide bomber in Southeast Asia, who was part of the family-based attack. And the sort of fundamental trigger or why she resort to having having her whole family doing that particular, orchestrating that particular attack, was that they wanted to be together in quote unquote heaven when they die as a martyr. So I think fundamental ideology also play a part, that women also want that same sort of recognition of being a martyr as men. And so in terms of intervention, building on of the points that, the rest of the co-panelists have mentioned, I think having women in terms of not just fronting PCV effort, but more importantly, in terms of counter ideology, at least for, to some level of or aspects, the ideology that is being pushed, especially on the lens of faith, that are largely distorted, is something that, through my observations, yes, those are still largely unequipped. We are still pushing more generic level of counter narratives that is not answering questions or answering the curiosity or the pull factors or push factors of why women then resort to more active roles within terrorist groups. So I think there is actually still a missing puzzle within the piece of PCVE. So I think other than having women representation in terms of policy making and the forefront of community engagement and in formal TT outfits, I think counter ideology, having a gender slant in counter ideology would definitely help and bring it a long way as well.
Thank you, Emelina. Jade?
Just some final observations, and I guess I'll kind of bridge the difference between Jennifer and Emelina's observations in that, yes, there were some similarities, but where we did see difference and caveating this, that it is at a macro level and there are gross generalizations and there's, differences in amongst that, was that men's support for the ideology was more extrinsic and it was more out of necessity. So it was more due to a lack of any other economic opportunity and just a pure need for them to want to provide for their family in the absence of any other option. For women, we found it was more philosophical and ideological based because of a belief in the ideology. So it was more intrinsic for why women joined. And I think this kind of gets to the last point that as Daesh started losing the caliphate, we saw them endorse women as combatants. And it was a somewhat deceptive kind of pretense of women's empowerment and spoke to that intrinsic motivation. So despite having subjugated women, for the preceding years and decade, they were now providing, this guise of women's empowerment and endorsement. And that kind of really spoke to those factors.
Thank you so much. Let me thank all of you for creating a fabulous mosaic of knowledge and experience and observations on what is a really complicated issue. I think there could be days of discussion on all of this, but I'm hoping that the participants in the conference today will go to the description of all of your work and look it up and do some more reading and be in touch with all of you. I know everybody's been very, very generous with saying, please be in touch, and everyone very willing to share their experience. Thank you all very much for this good session. That concludes session 5 of the Advancing Women, Peace and Security in the Indo-Pacific Conference. And I'm going to hand the virtual mic back over to Tavi Bullock to give you some logistical information regarding day 2 of the conference and introducing the keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela, and thank you for your excellent moderation of this session. And thank you also to our panelists for your critical insights and analyses on gender and preventing and countering violent extremism. I would also like to extend a personal thanks to our esteemed speakers across all 5 sessions today for their contribution to the wide range of probing, assumption challenging, and enlightening conversations, and their invigorating and inspiring calls to action amidst very real, current and emerging threats of regression on gender equality and human rights. But as Ms. Herrera from Indo-PACOM reminded us, the possibilities are endless. And through the collaboration of such passionate practitioners, scholars and advocates, as we have seen today, and I'm sure we'll see tomorrow, we should also feel energized and be optimistic about opportunities for achieving crucial gender equality and human rights goals through women and gender, peace and security perspectives, policies, agendas, and programming.